The blood on her traveling dress had long since dried to a rust-brown stain by the time the stagecoach rattled into Cripple Creek, Colorado, carrying Josephine Vance and the weight of her father's debts like stones in her stomach. It was September of 1878, and the mining town sprawled against the mountains like a promise half-kept, all wooden structures and muddy streets that spoke of fortune and desperation in equal measure. Josephine pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching the landscape shift from wilderness to civilization, though she used that word loosely. Her father had been dead 3 weeks, killed in a mining accident back in Kansas, and the letters had arrived swiftly after. Letters detailing money owed, promises made, contracts signed in desperation. She had sold everything, but it was not enough, never enough. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the depot, and Josephine gathered her worn carpet bag and the small leather satchel containing every document that proved her identity and her predicament. She was 22 years old, orphaned, and bound for her aunt's house somewhere in these mountains. At least, that was the plan. Her Aunt Martha had married a prospector 15 years ago and moved to a homestead 30 miles north of Cripple Creek. The letters had been sparse over the years, but Martha was family, and family was all Josephine had left. The driver climbed down from his perch with heavy footsteps that shook the coach. Silas Donovan was a thick-set man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that lingered too long on women traveling alone. Josephine had noticed it immediately when she boarded in Denver, the way his gaze had traveled over her worn dress and the absence of a wedding ring. She had kept her eyes down and her words few during the 2-day journey, but now she had no choice but to interact with him. "This is your stop, Miss Vance," Silas said, pulling open the door with more force than necessary. "Cripple Creek." "Thank you," Josephine said, accepting his rough hand to step down onto the dusty street. Her legs were unsteady after so many hours confined, and she nearly stumbled. His grip tightened, fingers digging into her wrist. "Careful now," he said, not releasing her even after she found her footing. "Wouldn't want you getting hurt." She pulled her hand back firmly. "I'm quite all right, thank you." He retrieved her trunk from the back of the coach, setting it down with a heavy thud that sent dust billowing around their feet. Other passengers were disembarking, a merchant and his wife, a young man who looked like he had come seeking his fortune in the mines. They collected their belongings and dispersed quickly into the town, leaving Josephine alone with the driver. "Now then," Silas said, crossing his arms over his broad chest, "there is the matter of your passage." Josephine's throat tightened. "I paid the fare in Denver. I have the receipt." "That fare was for passage to Cripple Creek," he said, his voice taking on an edge she did not like. "But you told me you are heading to a homestead north of here. That is additional travel, and it will cost you." "I plan to hire a wagon here in town," Josephine said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was told there would be transport available." "Transport costs money, Miss Vance. Do you have money?" The question hung between them like a noose. She had $43 left to her name, carefully hidden in the lining of her bag. It needed to last until she could find work, or until her aunt could help her establish herself. She could not afford to waste it on a driver's greed. "I have enough for my needs," she said carefully. Silas stepped closer, and she smelled tobacco and sweat. "Here is what I am thinking. You need a ride to your aunt's place, and I am the only driver making runs into those mountains this week. The fee is $50, or..." He paused, letting his eyes travel down her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "We could work out another arrangement." Josephine's chest went tight with anger and fear. She had encountered men like this before, men who saw a woman alone as an opportunity to be exploited. "I will find another way." "There is no other way," Silas said flatly. "Those mountains are rough country. You cannot walk it alone, and no one else is heading that direction. So you pay me $50, or you make yourself agreeable to me, or you sit here in Cripple Creek and wait until someone else decides to make the journey. Could be days, could be weeks." "You are despicable," Josephine said, her voice shaking with fury. "I am practical," he countered. "A woman like you, all alone, no husband, no money to speak of, you need to learn how the world works. Now, what is it going to be?" Before Josephine could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. The lady said no. Both Josephine and Silas turned toward the source of the voice. A man stood at the edge of the wooden walkway, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made the air around him seem smaller. He was dressed in buckskin and rough wool, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face, but Josephine could see the sharp line of his jaw and the dark hair that fell past his collar. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent more time in the wilderness than in town, and when he stepped closer, she saw the size of him, the thick muscles in his arms and chest, the way his hands rested casually near the knife at his belt and the rifle slung across his back. "This does not concern you, stranger," Silas said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. "You are standing in the middle of town making demands of a woman who clearly wants nothing to do with you," the stranger said, his voice low and calm but carrying an unmistakable threat. "That makes it my concern." "She owes me for passage," Silas tried again, but the excuse sounded weak even to Josephine's ears. The stranger's eyes, a startling shade of gray-blue even in the shadow of his hat, flicked to Josephine. "Did you pay your fare?" "Yes," she said, finding her voice. "In Denver, I have the receipt." He nodded once, then turned his attention back to Silas. "Then she owes you nothing. Move along." Silas's face reddened with anger and humiliation. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do? I know who you are, Carson Blackthorne. You are that mountain man who comes down from the high country once in a blue moon. You have got no authority here." "I do not need authority," Carson said simply. "I just need you to understand that if you do not leave this woman alone, you and I are going to have a problem, and you are not going to like how that problem gets solved." The threat was quiet, but absolute. Silas looked between Carson and Josephine, his jaw working as he calculated his options. Finally, he spat in the dust near their feet and climbed back onto the stagecoach driver's seat. "Keep her," he snarled. "She is more trouble than she is worth anyway." The stagecoach pulled away, wheels clattering over the uneven street, leaving Josephine standing beside her trunk with a stranger who had just defended her honor. She should have been frightened, should have been wary, but instead she felt a rush of relief so powerful it nearly made her dizzy. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him properly. "I do not know what I would have done if you had not intervened." Carson Blackthorne tipped his hat, and she got her first clear look at his face. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 30 or 31, with strong features weathered by sun and wind, a straight nose, and a mouth that looked like it did not smile often. His hair was indeed long, dark brown with hints of copper where the light caught it, tied back loosely at his nape. But it was his eyes that held her, steady and intelligent, assessing her with the same careful attention he might give to reading animal tracks in the forest. "You are welcome," he said. "What is your destination?" "My aunt's homestead, north of here," Josephine said. "Martha and Samuel Porter. Do you know them?" Something shifted in Carson's expression, a softening around his eyes. "I know Sam Porter. Good man. I did not know he had family coming." "It was a recent decision," Josephine said carefully, not wanting to explain her entire sad story to a stranger in the middle of the street. "He is expecting me, but I confess I do not know how to reach the homestead from here, and it seems the stagecoach driver was my only option for transport." Carson was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving past her to the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "Those mountains are no place for a woman alone," he said finally. "And Sam's place is a hard ride, even for someone who knows the country." "I do not have many choices," Josephine said, trying not to let her desperation show. "But I will find a way." "I'm heading back into the high country today," Carson said abruptly. "Sam's homestead is on the way. I can take you." Josephine blinked, surprised by the offer. "I could not ask you to do that. You have already done so much." "You are not asking. I am offering." He gestured toward her trunk. "Do you have supplies? Food? Warm clothes? It will be cold in the mountains, and the journey will take the better part of 2 days." 2 days? Josephine's heart sank. She had thought it would be a few hours at most. "The trail is rough and winds through high passes. We will need to camp overnight." He must have seen the hesitation in her face because he added, "I will keep my distance, and you will be safe. I give you my word." Josephine studied him, this man who had appeared like something out of a frontier legend, all muscle and quiet competence. She had no reason to trust him except for the fact that he had already helped her when he had no obligation to do so. And what choice did she have? She could spend her precious remaining money on a room in town and hope that someone else would eventually offer her transport, or she could accept this stranger's help and reach her aunt's home before her funds ran out entirely. "I have some supplies," she said slowly, "but I confess I am not prepared for mountain travel. I did not realize it would be so far or so difficult." "We will get what you need," Carson said. He picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing, his muscles bunching under his shirt, and started walking toward the general store. Josephine hurried to follow, her carpetbag clutched in her hands. The store was dim and crowded with goods, everything from mining equipment to bolts of fabric. Carson set her trunk down near the door and turned to the shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. "She needs traveling clothes," Carson said without preamble. "Wool skirt, flannel shirts, a good coat, sturdy boots, and a bedroll." The shopkeeper looked at Josephine with curiosity. "You're heading into the mountains, miss?" "Yes," Josephine said, "to my aunt's homestead." "You will want to dress warm then. Let me show you what we have." An hour later, Josephine had been outfitted with clothing more practical than anything she had ever owned. The wool skirt was heavy and warm, dyed a deep charcoal gray, and the flannel shirts were soft but sturdy. The coat was lined with sheepskin, and the boots were thick leather that came up past her ankles. She changed in the back room of the store, leaving her traveling dress folded in her trunk, and when she emerged, Carson gave her an approving nod. "Better," he said. "You will be able to move more easily in that, and you will not freeze at night." Josephine wanted to ask how much everything cost, but Carson had already paid the shopkeeper, waving away her protests with a firm shake of his head. "You can settle accounts with your aunt once we arrive," he said. "Right now, we need to get moving if we want to make good time before dark." They left the store and made their way to the livery stable at the edge of town. Carson's horse was a magnificent animal, a large buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. He also arranged for a pack mule to carry Josephine's trunk and their supplies, loading everything with practiced efficiency. "Can you ride?" Carson asked as he worked. "I can," Josephine said, though it had been years since she'd been on a horse. Her family had owned a small mare back in Kansas before her father had sold everything to pay for his ill-fated mining venture. Carson secured a saddle on a smaller horse, a bay mare with a gentle face, and helped Josephine mount. His hands on her waist were brief and impersonal, but she felt the strength in them, the ease with which he lifted her. She settled into the saddle, adjusting her skirts, and took the reins with hands that trembled slightly. "Stay close behind me," Carson said, swinging up onto his own horse with fluid grace. "The trail can be tricky, and I do not want you getting lost." They rode out of Cripple Creek as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western peaks. The town fell away behind them, replaced by open country that gradually gave way to forest. The trail climbed steadily, winding between stands of pine and aspen, the air growing cooler and thinner with each mile. Josephine focused on keeping her seat, her thighs already beginning to ache from the unaccustomed exercise, but she did not complain. She had asked for this journey, and she would see it through. Carson rode ahead, his posture relaxed but alert, constantly scanning their surroundings. He moved with his horse as though they were one creature, responding to the terrain with unconscious skill. Occasionally he would glance back to check on Josephine, and she would nod to show she was managing, though, in truth, she was growing more tired with each passing hour. As the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Carson turned off the main trail onto a smaller path that led to a sheltered clearing near a stream. "We will camp here," he announced, dismounting and beginning to unload the pack mule. Josephine slid from her horse with a stifled groan, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. Carson was at her side in an instant, his hand steadying her elbow. "You did well for your first day," he said. "Tomorrow will be easier once your body adjusts." "I hope you are right," Josephine said, attempting a smile. "I feel as though I have been beaten with sticks." The corner of Carson's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "Sit by the stream and rest. I will set up camp." Josephine did as instructed, sinking down onto a flat rock near the water and watching as Carson worked. He moved with impressive efficiency, setting up a small tent for her, arranging a fire pit, gathering wood, unpacking supplies. Within an hour, he had a fire burning cheerfully and coffee brewing in a battered pot. The smell of salt pork and beans cooking made Josephine's stomach growl loudly, and she pressed a hand to her middle in embarrassment. "When did you last eat?" Carson asked, not looking up from the pan he was tending. "This morning," Josephine admitted. "I had some bread and cheese in my bag." "That's not enough." He dished up 2 tin plates heaping with food and brought one to her, along with a fork and a cup of coffee so strong it could probably strip paint. "Eat. You need your strength." The food was simple but delicious, seasoned with salt and pepper and cooked over an open flame. Josephine ate ravenously, not caring about manners, and Carson watched her with something that might have been approval in his eyes. "Tell me about your aunt," he said, after they had both finished eating and were nursing second cups of coffee. "How long since you have seen her?" 15 years, Josephine said. "I was a child when she married Samuel and moved west. We exchanged letters, but not frequently. I barely remember what she looks like." "What brings you to her now?" Josephine hesitated, then decided that this man who had shown her nothing but kindness deserved at least some truth. "My father died 3 weeks ago. He left debts I cannot pay and a house that barely covered half of them. Aunt Martha is the only family I have left, and she wrote years ago that if I ever needed anything, I should come to her. So here I am." Carson was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the fire. "I'm sorry about your father," he said finally. "That is a hard thing." "Thank you." Josephine wrapped her hands around the warm tin cup, grateful for its heat as the mountain air grew colder. "May I ask you something?" He nodded. "Why did you help me today? You do not know me, and it was clear that the stagecoach driver was not someone to cross lightly." Carson's jaw tightened slightly. "Silas Donovan is a coward who preys on people who cannot fight back. I have no patience for men like that. And as for why I helped you specifically, well, I suppose I could not stand by and watch someone be threatened. It is not in my nature." "That is admirable," Josephine said softly. "In my experience, most people prefer to look the other way." "Then you have known the wrong people." Carson stood, collecting their plates and cups. "You should get some sleep. We have a long ride tomorrow, and you will want to be rested." Josephine rose stiffly, her body protesting the movement, and made her way to the small tent. Inside, Carson had laid out the bedroll and even placed her carpet bag within easy reach. It was more consideration than she had expected from a man who was essentially a stranger, and she felt a rush of gratitude that tightened her throat. She changed into her nightdress and crawled into the bedroll, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Outside, she could hear Carson moving around the camp, banking the fire, checking on the horses. Eventually, those sounds faded, and she heard him settling near the fire, his breathing deep and even. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. Josephine lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the forest, the rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl. Her mind kept returning to the man outside her tent, to the way he had stepped between her and danger without hesitation, to the quiet competence with which he moved through the world. Carson Blackthorne. Even his name sounded like something from a story, romantic and wild. She told herself not to be foolish. He was helping her reach her aunt, nothing more. Once they arrived at the homestead, he would continue on to wherever mountain men went, and she would begin her new life. There was no room for romantic fantasies, not when her future was so uncertain. But as she finally drifted into sleep, her last thought was of his eyes, gray-blue and steady, looking at her with something that might have been respect. Morning came cold and bright, with frost silvering the grass around their camp. Josephine woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and she emerged from the tent to find Carson already up, dressed, and cooking breakfast. He handed her a cup of coffee without a word, and she accepted it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warmth. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Sore," Josephine admitted, "but better than I expected." "That is good. We have a steep climb ahead of us today. The trail gets rougher from here." They ate quickly and broke camp with the same efficiency as the night before. Carson helped Josephine mount her horse, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary on her waist, and she wondered if she imagined the way his breath caught slightly. But then he was turning away, swinging onto his own horse, and they were moving again, climbing higher into the mountains. The trail did indeed grow steeper and more treacherous. In places, it narrowed to barely a horse's width, with sheer drops falling away on one side and rock faces rising on the other. Josephine kept her eyes on Carson's back, trusting him to lead them safely, even as her heart hammered with fear at the exposure. He never rushed, never pushed them beyond what was safe, and his calm presence steadied her nerves. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses near a high meadow carpeted with wildflowers that had not yet been killed by frost. The view was breathtaking, with peaks stretching away in every direction, their summits sharp against the impossibly blue sky. Josephine stood at the edge of the meadow, her hand shading her eyes, and felt something in her chest expand with wonder. "It is beautiful," she breathed. Carson came to stand beside her, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body in the cold mountain air. "This is why I live up here," he said quietly. "In the high country, there's a peace you cannot find anywhere else. No crowds, no noise, no people telling you who you should be or what you should do. Just you and the mountains and the sky." "It sounds lonely," Josephine said, glancing at him. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but loneliness is a small price to pay for freedom." She wanted to ask him more, to understand what had driven him into this solitary existence, but the set of his jaw told her the subject was closed. Instead, she said, "How much further to my aunt's homestead?" "Another few hours. We should arrive before sundown." He turned to face her fully, and she was struck again by his size, by the breadth of his shoulders and the solid strength of him. "You have done well on this journey, Josephine. Better than I expected." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Thank you, Carson. I could not have made it without you." Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion she could not name, but then it was gone, and he was walking back to the horses. "We should keep moving," he said, his voice carefully neutral. The final leg of the journey took them down from the high passes into a valley carved by a rushing river. The homestead appeared gradually, first as a curl of smoke visible above the trees, then as a collection of buildings nestled against the mountainside. There was a cabin, a barn, a chicken coop, and several other structures, all built with the sturdy practicality of people who had carved a life from the wilderness. As they rode into the clearing, a woman emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She was in her mid-40s, tall and thin, with graying blonde hair pulled back in a bun and a face that showed the marks of hard work and mountain sun. But her eyes were kind, and when she saw Josephine, they widened with recognition and joy. "Josie?" she called, using the childhood nickname Josephine had not heard in years. "Is that really you?" "Aunt Martha," Josephine said, sliding from her horse and hurrying forward into her aunt's embrace. The older woman smelled like bread and herbs, and her arms were strong as she held Josephine tight. "Lord above, child, I could not believe it when I got your letter. I thought you must be desperate indeed to make this journey." Martha pulled back, holding Josephine at arm's length to study her. "You look exhausted. Come inside. We will get some food in you and a proper bed to sleep in." "Ma, who is it?" A man appeared in the doorway of the cabin, tall and weathered, with a thick beard and kind eyes. Samuel Porter looked every inch the mountain homesteader, his hands calloused from years of hard work. "It is my niece Josephine," Martha called back, "the one I told you about." Samuel's face broke into a smile, and he came forward to shake Josephine's hand. "Welcome, miss. Any family of Martha's is family of ours." His gaze shifted past her to Carson, and his smile broadened. "Carson Blackthorne, what brings you down from your hermit's lair?" "Your niece needed an escort," Carson said, dismounting. "Ran into some trouble with Silas Donovan in Cripple Creek." Samuel's expression darkened. "That man is a menace. What did he do?" "Made demands that were not appropriate," Carson said evenly. "I convinced him to leave her alone." "I am sure you did," Samuel said with a knowing look. He turned to Josephine. "You were lucky Carson was there. He is the best tracker and guide in these mountains, and one of the few men I would trust with my family's safety." Josephine felt a rush of warmth toward the mountain man who had helped her. "He has been nothing but kind and respectful. I owe him a great deal." "You owe me nothing," Carson said firmly. "I was glad to help." "Nonsense," Martha said briskly. "You will stay for supper at the very least. I insist. It is the least we can do to thank you for bringing our Josie safely home." Carson hesitated, and Josephine found herself hoping he would agree. She was not ready to say goodbye to him yet, though she could not quite articulate why. After 2 days of his steady presence, the thought of him disappearing back into the mountains left her feeling strangely bereft. "I would be honored," Carson said finally, and Josephine's heart lifted. They spent the afternoon settling Josephine into the cabin's spare room, a small but cozy space with a real bed and a window that looked out onto the mountains. Martha fussed over her, bringing fresh water for washing and clean linens, chattering about life on the homestead and how glad she was to have family close again. "Samuel and I, we have wanted children for years," Martha confided as she helped Josephine unpack her trunk. "But the Lord never blessed us that way. Having you here, it feels like maybe our prayers have been answered differently than we expected." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. "I do not want to be a burden, Aunt Martha. I can work. I can help with the homestead. I am not afraid of hard labor." "Oh, sweetheart, you are not a burden. You are a gift." Martha squeezed her hand. "Now, wash up and come down for supper. I'm making my famous venison stew, and if I know Carson, he will appreciate a home-cooked meal." The stew was indeed delicious, rich and hearty, served with fresh bread and butter. They ate around a rough-hewn table in the main room of the cabin, the fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth. Samuel and Carson talked easily about hunting and trapping, about the early winter that seemed to be settling into the mountains, about mutual acquaintances scattered through the high country. Josephine listened, fascinated by this glimpse into Carson's life, by the respect Samuel clearly had for him. "How long have you been up in the mountains?" Josephine asked during a lull in the conversation. Carson looked at her across the table, his eyes reflecting the firelight. 10 years, give or take. I came west after the war, looking for something different than what I had known back east." "The war?" Josephine said softly. She had been a child during the Civil War, sheltered from its worst horrors, but she knew the scars it had left on the men who fought. "I do not talk about those days much," Carson said, his voice low. "They are past, and I prefer to leave them there." "That is fair," Josephine said quickly, not wanting to cause him pain. "I'm sorry for prying." "You are not prying. You're just trying to understand." He paused, then added, "I'm 31 years old, if you are wondering. Old enough to have seen some hard things, young enough to still have a life ahead of me." The way he said it, looking directly at her, made Josephine's pulse quicken. Was there meaning in those words beyond the simple facts? She was not sure, but she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. After supper, Samuel and Carson went outside to tend to the horses while Martha and Josephine cleaned up the dishes. Through the window, Josephine could see the two men talking in the fading light, their breath misting in the cold air. "Carson is a good man," Martha said quietly, following her gaze. "Solitary, but good. Samuel says he is the most honorable person he knows, and my husband does not give praise lightly." "He has certainly been kind to me," Josephine said, scrubbing a plate with perhaps more vigor than necessary. "He has been more than kind, from what Samuel tells me. Carson could have sent you to any number of other people to make this journey, but he brought you himself. That is significant." "Perhaps he was already heading this way," Josephine suggested, though she knew it sounded weak. Martha laughed softly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps he saw something in you that made him want to help. Would that be so terrible?" Josephine did not answer, but her heart was pounding as she watched Carson through the window, the way he moved with such unconscious grace, the way the lamplight from the barn caught in his dark hair. She barely knew him, had spent only 2 days in his company, but already she felt a connection to him that defied logic or reason. When the men came back inside, Carson announced that he needed to be moving on. "I have a camp about 5 miles north," he explained. "I need to check my trap lines before full dark." Josephine felt a stab of disappointment that she tried to hide. "Thank you again for everything you have done for me." "It was my pleasure," Carson said, and the way his eyes lingered on her face made her breath catch. "If you need anything, Samuel knows where to find me." "We will see you soon, I hope," Samuel said, clasping Carson's hand. "Do not be a stranger." Carson nodded, then hesitated at the door, looking back at Josephine. "Take care of yourself, Josephine Vance." "You as well, Carson Blackthorne," she replied, and watched as he disappeared into the darkness. The first weeks at the homestead passed in a blur of work and learning. Josephine threw herself into helping Martha and Samuel, determined to earn her keep. She learned to milk the cow, to gather eggs from the chickens, to make bread and preserve vegetables for the coming winter. Her hands grew rough and calloused, her body stronger from the constant physical labor. At night she fell into bed exhausted, but satisfied, feeling useful for the first time in her life. But despite the work and the warmth of her aunt and uncle's welcome, Josephine found her thoughts returning again and again to Carson. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he ever thought of her. Samuel mentioned him occasionally, reporting that he had seen Carson's tracks on the mountain trails or heard from other trappers that Carson was having a good season. He is a solitary soul, Samuel said one evening when he noticed Josephine's attention sharpen at the mention of Carson's name. But I think loneliness is wearing on him more than he wants to admit. Why do you say that? Josephine asked, trying to sound casual. Because in all the years I have known him, he has never gone out of his way for anyone the way he did for you. That tells me something is changing in him, whether he recognizes it or not. 3 weeks after Josephine's arrival, Carson appeared at the homestead with a deer carcass slung over his pack mule. It was late afternoon, and Josephine was in the garden pulling the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze solid. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats and felt her heart leap when she recognized the rider. Carson dismounted with his usual fluid grace, and Josephine found herself staring at him, drinking in the sight. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face shadowed with fatigue, but his eyes were as steady and gray-blue as ever. "Carson," she said, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt, "this is a surprise." "I had extra from my hunt," he said, gesturing to the deer. "Thought Sam and Martha could use it for their winter stores." Samuel emerged from the barn, greeting Carson with genuine pleasure, and the two men worked together to butcher the deer while Martha prepared coffee and invited Carson to stay for supper. He agreed with less hesitation than the first time, and Josephine felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Over the meal, Carson's eyes kept finding Josephine's, and she felt the weight of his attention, like the sun on her skin. They talked about the coming winter, about the signs that it would be a harsh one, about preparations that needed to be made. But underneath the mundane conversation, Josephine sensed something else, a tension that had not been there during their journey from Cripple Creek. After supper, Carson surprised everyone by asking Josephine if she would like to take a walk. "The moon is nearly full," he said, "and the night is clear. It would be a shame to waste it." Martha and Samuel exchanged meaningful glances but said nothing, and Josephine fetched her sheepskin coat and followed Carson outside. The cold air stung her cheeks, but the moonlight turned everything silver and magical, the mountains rising like ancient gods against the star-strewn sky. They walked in silence at first, following a path that led away from the cabin toward a grove of aspens. Finally, Carson spoke. "How are you settling in?" "Well," Josephine said, "better than I dared hope. Martha and Samuel have been wonderful, and I feel like I'm finally being useful." "You were always useful," Carson said. "You just needed a place where your usefulness could be appreciated." The simple kindness of the statement made Josephine's throat tighten. "That is generous of you to say." "It is the truth." Carson stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. "I have been thinking about you, Josephine, more than I probably should." Josephine's heart began to pound. "Have you?" "Yes. In fact, I have barely been able to think about anything else since I left you here." He ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "I told myself I was being foolish, that you were just someone I helped, that there was nothing more to it, but I cannot seem to convince myself of that." "Carson," Josephine breathed, taking a step closer to him. "I've been thinking about you too, constantly. I thought I was imagining things, that I was being ridiculous, but—" She did not get to finish the sentence because Carson closed the distance between them in one stride and pulled her into his arms. His mouth came down on hers, and Josephine melted into the kiss, her hands clutching at his shoulders, his coat, anything to keep herself grounded as the world spun around her. He kissed her with a hunger that matched her own, his arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Carson rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the first moment I saw you," he said roughly. "Standing there in Cripple Creek, facing down that bastard Donovan with more courage than any 3 men I know. You took my breath away." I thought you were a dream, Josephine confessed, someone too good to be real. I still am not entirely convinced you are not a figment of my imagination. Carson laughed, a low rumble that she felt through his chest. I'm very real, I promise you. He pulled back slightly to look at her, his hands framing her face. But I need you to understand something. I'm not an easy man, Josephine. I've lived alone for a long time, and I have gotten used to my own ways. I do not have much to offer you beyond a rough cabin in the mountains and a life that most people would consider too hard. I do not care about easy, Josephine said fiercely. I have seen what easy looks like, and it is a lie. What I want is honest, real. Someone who will stand beside me, not try to control me or use me. And from everything I have seen, that is exactly what you are. You barely know me, Carson protested, though his arms tightened around her waist. Then give me the chance to know you better. I'm not asking for promises or pledges, Carson. I'm just asking you not to disappear back into the mountains and forget about me. I could never forget about you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Forgetting you would be like forgetting how to breathe. They kissed again, slower this time, savoring the taste and feel of each other. Josephine felt something settle in her chest, a rightness that she had never experienced before. This man, with his quiet strength and his wounded past, felt like home in a way that no place ever had. When they returned to the cabin, hand in hand, Martha took one look at their faces and burst into delighted laughter. Well, it is about time, she declared. I was beginning to think you two were going to dance around each other all winter. We have not been dancing, Carson said, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice. You have been doing something, Samuel observed with a grin, and judging by my niece's expression, it went well. Josephine felt her cheeks heat, but she could not stop smiling. Carson stayed that night, sleeping in the barn at Samuel's insistence, and in the morning he announced that he would be staying in the area for the winter rather than heading deeper into the high country as he usually did. I have a cabin about 10 miles from here, he told Josephine as they stood together in the cold morning air, their breath mingling in clouds. It needs some work before the worst of winter hits, but it is solid. Would you come see it? I would like to know what you think. I would like that, Josephine said, her heart full to bursting. Over the following weeks, Carson became a regular presence at the homestead. He came several times a week, always bringing something useful game, firewood, news of the surrounding area. He helped Samuel with repairs to the barn and taught Josephine how to shoot, standing behind her with his arms around her as he adjusted her grip on the rifle, his presence warm and solid against her back. The first time she hit a target, she turned in his arms with a cry of delight, and he kissed her there in the fading afternoon light, not caring that Samuel and Martha could probably see them from the cabin. Josephine did not care either. She was falling in love with this mountain man, this gentle giant who had taken the reins when she needed him most and driven her safely home. Carson kept his promise and took her to see his cabin, a sturdy log structure tucked into a clearing surrounded by pines. It was sparse inside, just one large room with a stone fireplace, a bed, a table, and a few shelves. But it was clean and well built, with windows that let in the light and a door that hung straight on its hinges. It is not much, Carson said, watching her explore with an anxious expression that was entirely at odds with his usual confidence. But I built it with my own hands, and it has kept me safe and warm for 10 years. It is wonderful, Josephine said honestly. She could see the care that had gone into every aspect of the construction, the way the logs were perfectly notched, the way the fireplace was designed to draw efficiently. It feels like you. Would you want to live here? Carson asked abruptly, then seemed to realize what he had said. I mean, someday. If things between us continue the way they have been going, if you decided that you could tolerate having me around permanently. Josephine crossed to where he stood, taking his rough, calloused hands in hers. Carson Blackthorne, are you trying to ask me something? He swallowed hard, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked genuinely nervous. I am not good with words, Josephine. I have spent too many years with only the mountains and the animals for company. But I know that I love you. I know that I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing up to Silas Donovan, all fury and courage, wrapped up in a worn traveling dress. And I know that I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you, providing for you, loving you, if you will have me." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I love you too, Carson. You are the best man I have ever known, and I cannot imagine a future without you in it." He kissed her then, long and deep, and when he finally pulled back, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "We should tell Sam and Martha," he said. "Ask for their blessing." "They will be thrilled," Josephine said. "I think they have been planning our wedding since the first time you brought me to the homestead." She was right. When they returned to the cabin and shared their news, Martha cried with joy, and Samuel clapped Carson on the back hard enough to make even the big mountain man stagger. They celebrated with a special supper, and Martha immediately began planning a wedding for the spring, when the trails would be clear enough for a circuit preacher to make the journey into the mountains. But Carson had other ideas. "I do not want to wait until spring," he said. "I have waited long enough for happiness. If Josephine is willing, I would like to marry her before the first snow flies." Samuel considered this, then nodded. "There is a preacher who winters in Gold Hill, about 20 miles south. If we left tomorrow, we could reach him in 2 days and be back within a week." "That's awfully fast," Martha said, but she was smiling. "What do you think, Josie?" Josephine looked at Carson, at the hope and love shining in his eyes, and felt her decision settle into her bones with the weight of absolute certainty. "I think I have been waiting my whole life for this man. I see no reason to wait any longer." They were married 5 days later in the small church at Gold Hill, with Samuel and Martha standing as witnesses and a handful of local miners and homesteaders in attendance. Josephine wore a simple dress of ivory wool that Martha had made for her, and Carson wore clean buckskins and a shirt that Samuel had loaned him. He looked impossibly handsome and utterly terrified as he waited at the altar. But when Josephine walked down the aisle toward him, his face transformed with such joy that several of the rough miners had to wipe their eyes. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Carson kissed Josephine with enough passion to make Martha laugh and Samuel cough meaningfully. But Josephine did not care. She was married to the man she loved, and the future stretched before them bright with promise. They spent their wedding night at the small boarding house in Gold Hill, in a room with clean sheets and a real mattress. Carson was gentle with Josephine, taking his time to learn her body, to show her with his hands and mouth and the solid weight of him what words could never fully express. She discovered that beneath his quiet exterior lay a man of deep passion, of fierce protectiveness, of a love so profound it made her weep with the beauty of it. In the morning, wrapped in his arms with the winter sun streaming through the window, Josephine felt a contentment she had never known. "I love you," she whispered against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath her cheek. "I love you too," Carson rumbled, his hand stroking her hair. "More than I have words to say. You have given me something I thought I would never have, Josephine. A reason to come down from the mountains, a reason to build a life beyond mere survival." They returned to Samuel and Martha's homestead to gather Josephine's belongings, and then Carson took her home to his cabin. Their cabin now, he insisted, refusing to let her think of it as anything else. They spent the first weeks of their marriage preparing for winter, cutting wood, stocking the larder with game and preserved food, making the cabin as comfortable and weatherproof as possible. Josephine discovered that she loved the simple rhythm of their life together. She loved waking beside Carson in the big bed, loved cooking meals for him and watching the pleasure on his face when he ate. She loved the evenings spent by the fire, reading aloud from the few books they owned, while Carson worked on repairing traps or making snowshoes for the winter ahead. Most of all, she loved the way he looked at her, as though she were the most precious thing in his world. Winter came early and hard that year, just as the old-timers had predicted. Snow fell in heavy blankets, transforming the mountains into a landscape of pristine white and dark evergreens. The cabin became their entire world, cozy and warm while the wind howled outside. Carson continued to check his trap lines when the weather allowed, but more often they were snowed in for days at a time, just the two of them and the endless quiet of the mountains. It was during one of these long stretches of snowbound isolation that Josephine began to suspect she was pregnant. Her monthly courses, which had always been regular as clockwork, failed to arrive. Her breasts became tender, and certain smells made her stomach turn. She said nothing to Carson at first, wanting to be certain, but as the weeks passed and the signs became unmistakable, she could no longer keep the secret. She told him one evening after supper, when they were sitting together by the fire. "Carson, I have something to tell you." He looked up from the knife he was sharpening, his eyes immediately concerned. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said quickly, then smiled. "Better than fine, actually. I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Carson simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then the knife clattered to the floor and he was pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Josephine, are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor," she said, pulling back to look at his face. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" Carson laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I am terrified and thrilled and completely overwhelmed. A baby, our baby." He placed his large hand gently on her still flat stomach. "I never thought I would have this. A wife, a child, a real family. I thought that kind of happiness was for other men, not for someone like me." "Someone like you is exactly who deserves this happiness," Josephine said fiercely. "You are the best man I know, Carson Blackthorne, and you are going to be a wonderful father." Winter slowly gave way to spring, and as the snow melted and the trails became passable again, Carson took Josephine down to Samuel and Martha's homestead to share their news and to see if Martha could help ensure Josephine had proper care for the pregnancy. Martha was beside herself with joy, already planning and preparing for the arrival of her great niece or nephew. "You will come stay with us for the birth," Martha insisted. "I know you love your cabin, but when the time comes, you will want another woman nearby, and Samuel can ride for the doctor in Cripple Creek if needed." Josephine and Carson agreed, though Carson made it clear he would not leave Josephine's side during the birth, regardless of tradition or propriety. "She is my wife," he said simply, "and I will be there." The months that followed were among the happiest of Josephine's life. Her body changed and grew as their child developed inside her, and Carson treated her like she was made of glass, constantly worrying and fussing until she had to remind him that pregnant women had been doing physical work since the dawn of time. But she secretly loved his protectiveness, the way his eyes would track her movements whenever she was near, the way his hand would rest on her swelling belly whenever they sat together. In June, they made the journey down to the homestead and settled into the guest room to wait. The summer was warm and pleasant, with long golden evenings and the sound of the river constant in the background. Josephine helped Martha with the garden and the household chores as much as her growing body would allow, while Carson and Samuel worked on expanding the barn and repairing fences. The baby came in late July, on a night when the air was thick and humid and the sky flickered with heat lightning. Josephine's labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Carson's face went white with fear, but Martha remained calm and steady, guiding them through each stage. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced, Carson wept openly as he held his son for the first time. "A boy," he said in wonder, cradling the tiny infant against his broad chest with infinite care. "We have a son, Josephine." "What should we name him?" Josephine asked, exhausted but radiant, as she watched her husband fall in love with their child. Carson looked at Samuel, standing in the doorway with tears streaming down his weathered face. "If you are willing, I would like to name him Samuel, after the man who has been more of a father to me than my own ever was." Samuel could not speak for a moment, could only nod as his wife wrapped her arm around his waist. "It would be an honor," he finally managed, "a great honor." They named the boy Samuel Carson Blackthorne, and he thrived from his first breath. He was a big baby, healthy and strong, with his father's dark hair and his mother's delicate features. Carson was utterly besotted, spending hours just watching the baby sleep, marveling at the perfection of his tiny fingers and toes. They stayed at the homestead through the rest of the summer, allowing Josephine to recover fully and the baby to grow strong before making the journey back to their cabin. When they finally returned home in September, almost exactly 1 year after Josephine had first arrived in Colorado, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had left Kansas broken and desperate, with nothing but debts and grief. Now she had a husband who loved her, a beautiful son, and a life that felt rich beyond measure despite its material simplicity. The years that followed were not always easy. Mountain life was hard, with long winters and short growing seasons, with the constant work required to maintain the cabin and provide food for the table. There were lean times when game was scarce, and frightening times when sickness threatened. But through it all, Carson and Josephine faced every challenge together, their love deepening with each passing season. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Martha after Josephine's aunt, and another son they named Daniel. The cabin grew crowded with children and laughter, with toys made from carved wood and dolls fashioned from scraps of fabric. Carson proved to be exactly the father Josephine had known he would be, patient and loving, teaching his children to read and write, to respect the wilderness, to be honest and kind. Samuel and Martha remained a constant presence in their lives, visiting often and welcoming the growing family whenever they came down from the mountains. The bond between the 2 families was unbreakable, forged in love and mutual respect. On warm summer evenings, when the children were finally asleep and the cabin was quiet, Carson and Josephine would sit together on the porch he had built, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Sometimes they would talk about the journey that had brought them together, about the cruel stagecoach driver who had inadvertently pushed Josephine into Carson's path, about the choices and chances that had led to this life they had built. "Do you ever regret it?" Carson asked one such evening, his arm around Josephine's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Giving up the possibility of an easier life in town, marrying a mountain man and living in the middle of nowhere?" Josephine tilted her face up to look at him, at the strong lines of his jaw and the gray-blue eyes that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. "I have never regretted it for a single moment," she said firmly. "You took the reins when I needed you most, Carson. You drove me home, not just to my aunt's homestead, but to this life, to you. You are my home. You always will be." Carson kissed her then, tender and sweet, and Josephine felt the same flutter of joy she had felt the first time his lips had touched hers. Some things, she thought, never changed. Love like theirs was built to last, as enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. "I love you, Josephine Blackthorne," Carson murmured against her hair, "more than words can ever say." "And I love you," she replied, "always and forever." The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and in the valley below, a coyote called to its mate. Inside the cabin, their children slept safely, dreaming whatever dreams children dream. And on the porch, 2 people who had found each other against all odds held tight to the love that had saved them both, grateful for every moment, every breath, every heartbeat they shared. Years later, when Samuel and Martha had passed on to their rest and Carson and Josephine had become the elder generation, they would tell their grandchildren the story of how they met. About the stagecoach driver who had made cruel demands, about the mountain man who had taken the reins and driven a desperate young woman to safety. The children would listen with wide eyes, asking for the story again and again, never tiring of the tale of true love found in the wilds of Colorado. And every time they told it, Carson would look at Josephine with the same love and wonder he had felt that first day in Cripple Creek, when a proud, frightened woman had stood her ground against a man twice her size and stolen his heart without even trying. Every time they told it, Josephine would remember the feeling of Carson's hand on her waist as he helped her onto her horse, the steady strength of his presence during those 2 days of travel, the moment she had realized that this stranger had become everything to her. Their love story became legend in those mountains, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of courage and kindness, of meeting the right person at the right moment, of choosing love even when life had given you every reason to give up. The cabin where they raised their family still stood decades after they were gone, a monument to 2 people who had found in each other a home that transcended walls and roofs, that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in the meeting of eyes across a room, in the simple, profound act of choosing each other every single day. And if sometimes, on clear mountain nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, travelers in those high passes swore they could hear laughter drifting on the wind or see 2 figures sitting together on a porch that should not have been there, well, those who knew the story would just smile and say that some love was too strong to be contained by something as simple as mortality, Some love once kindled burned forever. Carson and Josephine had found that kind of love against all odds in the wild heart of the Colorado mountains, and nothing, not time, nor distance, nor the inevitable march of years, could ever truly take it away. Their youngest son, Daniel, grew up to be a doctor, bringing medical care to the scattered homesteads and mining camps of the region. Their daughter, Martha, married a good man and raised 5 children of her own, teaching them the values of hard work and kindness that her parents had instilled in her. And Samuel, their firstborn, took over the family's trap lines and guide business, becoming known throughout the territory for his skill and integrity, traits he had learned from watching his father. But more than their individual accomplishments, the children carried forward the legacy of their parents' love. They had grown up watching Carson and Josephine navigate life as true partners, seeing the respect and affection that never dimmed between them, learning that love was not just a feeling, but a choice made fresh each morning. That lesson shaped them, made them better people, better parents, better partners to their own spouses. On Carson's 70th birthday, the family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. Children and grandchildren filled every corner of the space, spilling out onto the porch and into the yard, their voices raised in laughter and song. Carson sat in his favorite chair by the fireplace, his hair now silver, but his shoulders still broad and strong, his eyes still that remarkable gray blue. Josephine sat beside him, her hand in his, her own dark hair threaded with white, her face lined with years of mountain sun and laughter. "Look at what we built," Carson said softly, for her ears alone, gesturing to the crowded room full of their descendants. All of this from one moment of courage in a dusty street. "From 2 moments of courage," Josephine corrected gently. "You were just as brave as I was, stepping in to help a stranger. Not everyone would have done that." "I could not have done anything else," Carson said, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "You needed help, and I was there. It was as simple and as complicated as that." Their grandson, little Samuel, who was named for his great-great-uncle and his grandfather both, climbed onto Carson's lap, all of 5 years old and full of questions. "Grandpa, tell me again about how you met Grandma, about the bad man and how you saved her." Carson exchanged a glance with Josephine, and she saw the love and contentment shining in his eyes. "Well," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the room, causing conversation to still as everyone turned to listen. "It was September of 1878, and the most beautiful woman I had ever seen stepped off a stagecoach in Cripple Creek." As Carson told the story one more time, with Josephine occasionally interjecting corrections or additions, their family listened with the same rapt attention they always did. Because it was not just a story about how 2 people met. It was a story about choosing courage over fear, kindness over cruelty, love over loneliness. It was a story about taking the reins when someone needed help, about driving them safely home, about building a life together from nothing but hope and determination, and the profound connection 2 souls could forge in the wilderness. When the celebration finally wound down and the visitors departed to their own homes, Carson and Josephine stood together on their porch one last time, watching the sun set behind the mountains in a glory of orange and gold. The air was cool with the promise of autumn, and Josephine pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Immediately, Carson's arm came around her waist, his body warming her as it had for so many years. "Are you happy?" Josephine asked, though she knew the answer. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Carson said. "You gave me everything, Josephine. A family, a purpose, a reason to be more than just a man hiding in the mountains. You made me whole." "We made each other whole," Josephine said, leaning into his embrace. "We were both broken when we met, both running from different kinds of pain. But together, we built something beautiful, something that will last long after we are gone." "I love you," Carson said, the words as fervent as they had been the day he first spoke them. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Josephine replied, turning in his arms to kiss him as the last light faded from the sky. "Always and forever, my mountain man, always and forever." They stood there as darkness fell and the stars emerged one by one, 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a love story for the ages. The mountains stood eternal around them, witness to the promises they had made and kept, guardian of the home they had created together. And if the night seemed to hold its breath in honor of their devotion, well, perhaps even the wilderness recognized something sacred when it saw it. Their story did not end that night, or even with their eventual passing years later, both of them going peacefully in their sleep within hours of each other, as though neither could bear to be in a world without the other. Their story lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the cabin that stood as a testament to Carson's skill and devotion, in the retelling of how a stagecoach driver's cruelty had inadvertently brought two perfect souls together. And sometimes, on clear mountain nights, when the moon was full and the stars were bright, people swore they could still see them. A tall, broad-shouldered man and the woman who had captured his heart, walking hand in hand through the high passes, their love echoing through eternity, as timeless and enduring as the mountains themselves. The story of Carson Blackthorne and Josephine Vance became more than just a family legend. It spread through the territory, passed from homesteader to miner, from guide to traveler, becoming part of the mythology of the Colorado high country. Young women dreamed of finding love like theirs, and young men aspired to the kind of honorable masculinity Carson had embodied. It was a story that reminded people that goodness existed in the world, that love could triumph over hardship, that two broken people could find healing in each other's arms. In the end, that was their greatest legacy, not just the children they raised or the land they tended, but the proof they provided that love, real and true and lasting, was possible even in the harshest circumstances. They had taken the worst life could throw at them and transformed it into something beautiful, something worth remembering, something worth aspiring to. And so the story ended as all the best stories do. With love triumphant, with family gathered close, with two souls bound together so tightly that not even death could separate them. The stagecoach driver who had made cruel demands of her had faded into obscurity, a footnote in a tale much larger than himself. But the mountain man who had taken the reins and driven her home, who had seen her worth when she felt worthless, who had loved her with a devotion that never wavered, he became immortal in the retelling, as did the brave, beautiful woman who had chosen to love him back. Their story was complete, their ending happy, their love eternal. And in the high country of Colorado, where the mountains meet the sky and the wilderness still holds sway, their legacy lives on, a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever doubted that true love exists. It does. It did. And it always will, as long as there are people brave enough to take the reins when someone needs them, to drive each other home, to build a life from love and nothing else. The end.